War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 69, the Department of War. Okay, I'm going to wing this one. I don't have a script. First time I'm doing this. We'll see how it goes. I've been traveling all week, and I did not feel like cramming down a script and doing all the work that goes into making one of the more traditional episodes. And it just so happens that President Trump floated an idea which caught my attention and has been a point of focus for me since I got back from Afghanistan in 2009. So a little on the personal side. First off, I was gone on vacation. My middle son is getting ready to deploy overseas, and I was visiting him and taking his car back so he didn't have to store it and pay the insurance while storing it, which they still charge. I saw my oldest son, who served, got out. He also did an overseas deployment for a year and has my granddaughter, so very excited to see both of them. And also, I've recently been part of something called Real Plastic Heroes. I invite you to go to realplasticheroes.com and check out the website. And essentially what it did, they are taking 8 real veterans of the global war on terror from Air Force, Navy, Marines, Army, and they're modeling toy soldiers after them. It's 100% made in the United States. They're bigger than normal toy soldiers, not like huge or an encumbrance, but maybe 50% bigger than what you'd think of. And they're all based on real people who were photographed and modeled in what they wore when they went into combat. So it's a really cool concept. Hopefully they'll be on sale in October. Everything was done in the United States. The artist is an American who transformed the photographs into models. The machining of the injection molds was done in the United States, and all the injection molding is being done in the United States. And that had to be almost a reclaimed technology. There's not many injection molding factories anymore. So the creator of this had to go out and redo all of this. So I invite you to check them out. Maybe it'll be a really nice Christmas toy if you've got kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews, or just maybe you want to play with them yourself. I completely understand. So realplasticheroes.com. They don't pay me a dime. I just think it's a really cool concept that I'm fortunate enough to be a part of and wanted to get that out. So on to President Trump and the Department of War. So when the nation was founded, there were 2 departments dedicated to waging America's battles. You had the Department of War and you had the Department of the Navy. And both of these had the Secretary of War and the Secretary of the Navy. You may be familiar with the Secretary of the Navy. It still exists, albeit in a different form. And this dual secretariat at the cabinet level lasted all the way until after World War II, when, for various reasons, it was deemed that it was no longer a good construct for warfighting, primarily because of the advent of airplanes combined with nuclear weapons. The Air Force was basically carved out of the Department of War, which was effectively what we now call the Department of the Army. And the Marine Corps was part of Department of the Navy. So as the Air Corps blossomed from the Wright brothers and the canvas and wood and whatnot of World War I and became much more capable, the assumption was that the Air Force would always be the little brother to the Army, much as the Marine Corps are kind of the little brother to the Navy. Well, that just really wasn't working, primarily because of budget, but also the technology involved. Something to remember with the Secretary of War and then Secretary of the Navy is these were full cabinet positions. These were not subordinate cabinet positions. Now, the Secretary of Defense is the only cabinet secretary. Then you have the Secretary of the Army, Secretary of the Air Force, and Secretary of the Navy, who work directly subordinate to the Secretary of Defense. And so it was a bit of a demotion for those secretaries because the Department of Defense was neither Army nor Navy nor Air Force. It was a totally new entity. The Air Force was very upset at this. They did not want to be a subordinate secretary. They wanted to be a cabinet level position like the previous secretaries of war and secretary of Navy. But what they did was the Secretary of Defense is the secretary for waging all wars who works directly for the president. But he doesn't control the budget. In a little weird ninja move, the budgets are allocated by the subordinate secretaries, the service secretaries. So Sec Army gets some, Sec Navy gets some, Sec Air Force gets some. And traditionally, it's been about a one-third, one-third, one-third. So when we created Space Command, that fell under the United States, or the Secretary of the Air Force, much as the Marine Corps falls under the Secretary of the Navy. And the Army is now the only service that doesn't, or I should say the only secretariat that does not have two services underneath it. And this kind of leads into some inside baseball for the Pentagon, which I was unaware of until I started working in D.C. as an Army officer. And you have the three service secretaries, and they have been effectually given well-earned monikers. The Army is the Department of Dumb. The Air Force is the Department of Dishonest. And the Navy is the Department of Disobedient. And I'll explain what these mean. The Army being the Department of Dumb is self-explanatory. We are not good at politics. And I say we because I come from the Army. We suck at it. We do not navigate the halls of Congress and the Pentagon very well. Our equities are always last, and we always fail at, obviously, the mission. If you look at the record of the Army since 1945, we're not doing so great. And we fail at, as noted, protecting our equities, specifically via air support through the Air Force. The Air Force is the Department of Dishonest. They will say they are going to do something, and they just won't do it. And no one does anything because they control Congress, because they control the procurement dollars that go into buying their airplanes. Even though the Army is by far the largest service by people, and people are the most expensive component of the Department of Defense's budget, the Air Force still has about the same budget, if not a little bit higher than the Army, because the airplanes that they procure are so exquisitely expensive. And such, they are able to essentially, I won't say bribe politicians, but they are adept at ensuring politicians receive ample compensation for their support through procurements, which is a fancy Army term for buying stuff through their districts. The F-35 famously is made, I believe, in 47 different states. This is not due to any sort of efficiency gained. It's simply by spreading the money as far and wide as possible of procurement, the Air Force is able to buy more support for what they want. So if the SecDef or the president says, hey, Air Force, do something, the Air Force will say they are going to do it. Don't get me wrong. They just won't. And the number of times this has been done is incalculable. And their reputation as the Department of Dishonest is well earned. Then you have the Department of Disobedient, and I respect this a little bit more. If the Secretary of Defense or the President or the House Armed Services Committee or the Senate Armed Services Committee tells the Navy, you will do this, the Navy will say, no, we won't, and we'll just ignore you and do whatever we want to. The Marines are very adept at this as well. And likewise, they have enough support through the shipbuilding and their own aircraft procurement that they can get away with it. And so the Air Force and the Navy are very adept, either through dishonesty or disobedience, in protecting their own equities. The Army's stupid, and everyone will tell you that who's ever worked in the Pentagon. The best officers in the Marines and the Air Force certainly are given tours in the Pentagon early because they want to prepare them for the battle that matters the most, the battle for money. It really is the only war that the Department of Defense was ever created to successfully fight and win, and that's the war of taking as much money from the taxpayers and buying the things they want to buy so that they can have juicy retirement gigs. That's kind of how it goes. So how bad is this? Well, it's pretty bad. And that's why Trump is looking at going back to the Department of War versus Department of Defense. But changing the name will change nothing. It's a very symbolic move, and it identifies a weakness that we have. So why has the Department of Defense done so badly? I'm spreading around a lot of blame, and a lot of it is deserved, but not all of it. I'm being a little unfair. I'll be the first to admit that. So the Department of Defense was created to spend a lot of money and to never, ever fight a war. And they're really good at spending a lot of money, and they're really, really bad at fighting wars because they weren't designed to. And in their defense, in 1947, when the Department of Defense was created, the assumption was all wars would be atomic, they would be all out, and they would be an existential threat to humanity. Therefore, we must never again fight a war. And the Department of Defense reflects this overriding consideration. And every time they're forced into fighting a war, we do it horribly. And the excuse is never that we suck at fighting wars. The excuse is always, it was the wrong kind of war. Well, it's been 80 years since we created the Department of Defense. And maybe the excuses need to stop. So going back to how the Department of Defense is structured now, and it's gone through some iterations, Unified Command Plan. Big one's Goldwater-Nichols Act in 1986, approximately 40 years after DOD was created in 1947. 40 years later, we did the Goldwater-Nichols, which created like the joint officer and a whole bunch of joint medals and a whole bunch of joint commands and a whole bunch of new slots for general officers. But we haven't gotten any better at warfighting. But we did create a lot more general slots and we spent a lot more money, which again reinforces the primary focus of the Department of Defense. So who actually fights our wars? Well, you might be surprised to learn it's not the Army, the Air Force, or the Navy. It's what we call our combatant commands. And we have the unified combatant commands. Now there's 7 geographic ones, and they are responsible for fighting wars in their area of operations. You've got AFRICOM for Africa. You've got CENTCOM, which is Central Command, and it's the Middle East. So CENTCOM was all the hotness during Global War on Terror because that's where pretty much all the action was. But there was some work in AFRICOM that was related to it. Then you have EUCOM, European Command. During the Cold War, EUCOM was the big deal because we had to fight off the Soviet hordes, the commies coming across the border. We have PACOM, which is now called Indo-PACOM for India Pacific Command, which is a really awkward name. And they just changed the name to go, the Indian Ocean is important. Therefore, we must change the name. Have we gotten any better at fighting wars because of the name change? No, but somebody felt really important. When I retired, it was still PACOM. So Mama called him PACOM. I'm going to call him PACOM. But it's technically Indo-PACOM, which just sounds stupid. You have Southcom, which is Southern Command, which covers primarily South America. You have Northern Command, which covers the United States, which is kind of weird if you think about it. Why is the Title 10, which is restricted to not fighting in the continental United States and in the 50 states, Title 10 forces can't actually, they shouldn't be fighting wars. They can fight wars if we're invaded, but Northcom didn't always exist. That was one of the creations after 9/11. Did it make us safer? Well, there hasn't been another 9/11, but I'd argue it was more of, let's create a new headquarters. And then there's Space Com, which is now a unified combatant command for space, but now we're getting into this weird place where, space is over all of these others. So who's in charge of space? What is that altitude? I went over this in the space domain. It's another... So is CENTCOM responsible for the space over Central Command's area of operations? Is EUCOM responsible for the space? Yes and no. But it's another 4-star command that is absolutely reserved for the Air Force's new little brother, SpaceCom. So therefore, it's really important. Then you have what's called the functional commands. And you have Cyber Command, again, but that's in a support role to all the geographic combatant commanders. You have Special Operations Commander, SOCOM. You have STRATCOM, which is Strategic Command, which is weird in so much as it is a functional command, supposedly in support of the Unified Combatant Commanders, the Geographic Combatant Commanders, but it actually wages war because STRATCOM controls our nuclear arsenal. Except it does, but then you have nuclear submarines that are armed in the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and theoretically in the Arctic Ocean and maybe in the Indian Ocean. I don't know where all they are, but so the bulk of our nuclear arsenal is found in nuclear submarines, which are in other geographic combatant commands that do not control assets that work in there, but that actually goes against the whole point of the unifying combatant commands. Don't want to get too far into it. It doesn't really match well. And then you have TRANSCOM, which is Transportation Command. Even though 90% of everything that moves outside the continental United States moves by ship, TRANSCOM has almost been a reserved command for the Air Force. The Navy very occasionally has commanded, I think, only once or twice in its history. The rest of the time, TRANSCOM has always been an Air Force officer whose primary job is to ensure that the Army never gets any sort of transportation support from any sort of Air Force aircraft. In fact, they make it so that it's so expensive to use their aircraft that we end up chartering commercial flights to fly soldiers, even though we already paid for all these C-17s and C-130s, because the Air Force just says, yeah, we'll support the Army, and then they don't. Back to dishonest. So how bad is the Army? Well, of the 7 combatant commands, geographic combatant commands, not one is commanded by an Army officer. Not Europe, not CENTCOM, not SOUTHCOM, none of them. Because the Army can't protect its own equities. It's just a disaster. So those are the combatant commands. Now, who do they work for? Well, all of 11 of these unified combatant commands report directly to the Secretary of Defense. They don't report to the Army or anything like that. And they're responsible for fighting our nation's wars. But going back to how the budget works, all the money goes to the services. So what happens is, and I saw this during Global War on Terror, if the commander of CENTCOM wants a capability, wants an aircraft or a ship or a ground vehicle, he doesn't get it unless one of the services, who has no responsibility whatsoever to the Secretary of Defense or the combatant commanders, they don't buy it. If they don't want it, they're not going to buy it. So the war fighters are at the whims of whatever the services feel like buying. And sometimes the services are really stupid in what they buy. The Navy with their littoral combat ship, the Army with their strikers, the Air Force with their F-35s. Not that it's necessarily a bad aircraft, but it's purchased to the exclusion of all others. And so if you want a dedicated close air support aircraft, well, too bad. You don't get that. And we don't care if that's what you need to fight your wars, and we don't care if people die because of our decisions. We're here to spend money and to never fight a war. And that's the primary problem, is the mission is separate from the money. And if President Trump really wants to change the Department of Defense into a warfighting organization, it can't just be a name change. Changing from PACOM to INDOPACOM isn't changing anything. So what I propose, and one of the reasons I started this podcast is I've had this idea for years, is I have no platform. No one cares what I have to say about anything because I'm not a general officer. I didn't spend 20 years losing a war to illiterate goat herders in the sands of Central Command. So therefore, my opinion has no value. You need these top flight people who don't know how to fight wars, but they know how to spend money. That's whose opinion matters. And the last thing they want is accountability for how that money is spent. So I do agree with President Trump that fundamental restructuring needs to start. And I love the idea of going back to the old names. But what I would recommend is that you have 2 secretaries and get rid of the service secretaries. And these are what I would call mission secretaries. You would have the Secretary of Expeditionary Warfare, and you would have the Secretary of Strategic Warfare. Now, Expeditionary Warfare, it kind of sounds a little cheesy. Maybe we just call it Secretary of War and Secretary of the Navy, and the Navy could be expeditionary, and the Secretary of War could be the strategic. So how would these break down? Well, all of the geographic combatant commanders would fall under the Secretary of Expeditionary Warfare, Sec Strike, whatever you want to call it. And they would be responsible for fighting wars outside the United States. And then the functional commands, including SpaceCom and NORTHCOM, would all fall under the Secretary of Strategic Warfare, along with some of the reserves. Now, this kind of says, well, what do we do with the services? How would the services, the Army, Navy, and Air Force, how would they get their money? Well, the budget would all go to the mission secretaries, Sec Strike, Sec Strat, and the services would bid for missions, and they would procure the equipment to meet the mission demands given to them by the various secretaries, whether it was the functional secretaries, the functional secretary of Sec Strat, so our nuclear arsenal, our transportation assets, our cyber capabilities, SOCOM. I'm not sure we really need SOCOM, but it's still there. And then the geographic combatant commanders would fund people to procure equipment and to man, train, and equip, which is the primary missions of the services right now. They would be funded through these mission secretaries to provide the manning, the training, and the equipping that would support their missions. Because right now, the money has nothing to do with the missions, and our results in 20 years of GWAT reflect that. So, this went a little bit longer than I thought. Not quite as tight as the last time. I really don't care. I don't feel like messing with this podcast today. I'll be back in form next week, I promise. So, make the Department of War great again. I am down for it, but it can't just be a name change. We need to fundamentally restructure how the Department of Defense works. And we do it every 40 years. We did it in 1947. We did it in 1986. The time is right for another 40-year restructuring to take the lessons learned on the battlefield, paid in blood, and let's do better to our war fighters, and let's provide them the tools they truly require to be successful. We need all new officer corps. We need a joint corps. We need all kinds of things that I'd be more than willing to talk about. This could go on for hours because this is something I really care about and I've thought about for well over a decade. And we need to fix things. And I think the President Trump is the kind of person who will fix things. I don't know if Secretary Hegseth is the guy who thinks top down versus bottom up. He strikes me as a bottom up kind of guy. He wants to fix things with the troops first and foremost, and I admire that, and I agree with a lot of what he is doing. However, we do need a top-down restructuring. We need to fix things at the same level that we did after 1947. We finished World War II and said we can never fight a war like this again, and that was a very good call. Well, we just fought a 20-year war against little goat herders, and we lost. And we can't do that again either. So let's fix it. Let's get Congress involved. So I'm going to do another call to action for you guys. Please share this podcast. This one actually matters. We can do better. We can restructure DOD. We can spend less money and win more wars, and I'm all about that. And hey, check out Real Plastic Heroes for me. I appreciate it, and I'll catch you guys next week. And I apologize for this format. Let me know what you think about it. Send me an email, send me a text, whatever. I'll see you. Bye. Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.